right? So the last topic in NoSQL database is like sharding. So sharding is the process of storing the data records across multiple machines, right? So you are going to store the data records across multiple machines, and it's the MongoDB approach to meet the demand of data growth, right? So when someone needs some data, you are going to retrieve not data only from a single machine, but it is spread across multiple machines, right? So as the size of the data increases, a single machine may not be sufficient to store the data nor provide the acceptable read or write throughput, right? So sharding solves the problem with horizontal scaling, right? So since we want it to be responsive, uh, available 24/7, so what happens is that you need to store the data across multiple machines to meet the requirements of data growth, right? So a single machine is not sufficient to store the data nor provide the acceptable read and write throughput. So sharding solves the problem using horizontal scaling, right? So you have an application server, you have a configuration server, and finally you have the replica set, right? So these are the major components in sharding. So the shard is used to store the data. So it is used to provide high availability and data consistency. So in production environment, each shard is a separate replica set, right? So you are going to duplicate the data block to support high availability, and shard is used to store the data, right? So you have this configuration servers that are used to store the clusters metadata, right? So this data contains a mapping of cluster data to shared, right? So the configuration server like metadata information about the data that is being stored across the different shared. So the query router uses this metadata to target operations to specific shared, right? So these are the three components in sharding. So you have a router, you have a configuration server, you have the shared where the actual data is stored, replicated or duplicated, and spread across multiple nodes. So the configuration server contains the metadata about the data that is being stored in a shared, right? So configuration server stores the clusters metadata. So this data contains a mapping of the clusters data set to shared. So the query router, it uses this metadata to target operations to specific shared. And finally, query router or basically MongoDB instances, it interfaces with the client applications and direct operations to the appropriate shared, right? So the query router, it is used to act as an interface with the client applications, and it direct operations to the appropriate shared. So the query router process and targets the operations to shared and then returns the result to client, right? So a shared cluster can contain more than one query router to divide the client request load, right? So to act as an interface between the client and the shared, we have this query router, right? So the query router process and targets the operations to shared and then returns the results to the client, right? Right. So